promised land after the death and resurrection of Christ. And in fact, Jesus' last earthly words before his ascension is, "And go into Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, proclaiming the good news." God's people are no longer known by the lands they inhabit. They are now known by the lands they are sent to. If in the Old Testament diaspora was seeming punishment for unfaithfulness, in the New Testament diaspora becomes the norm. God's people are meant to be on the move. We call those early Christian authors and writers apostles. That comes from the Greek apostello, which means to go. We are not necessarily meant to be a settled people, but to be a dispersed. Diaspora comes from the Greek, meaning literally scattered about. That is who we are supposed to be. And I think the crescendo of that diaspora mentality, diaspora ethic, if you will, for New Testament Christ followers is found in Acts 8. Now in Acts 8, Paul is still Saul and he is still seething violence against the early church. And so we read, "And Saul approved of their killing of him, Stephen. That day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went from place to place, proclaiming the word." Before Jesus ascends, he says, "Go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, proclaiming the good news as you go." What do you think the 11 disciples who were remaining and the other followers of Jesus did after he commissioned them and then ascended to the right hand of God the Father? What do you think the disciples did? They immediately went back to the temple in Jerusalem and began to break bread and be merry. And you can read those stories in Acts 2 and Acts 4. And often churches, even to this day, use the story of Acts 2 as a blueprint for who we are supposed to be. You probably have heard the passage read, typically around Pentecost or shortly thereafter, where they committed themselves to praying, where people sold off property and they gave the excess to the church and they fed a bunch of people, and it was lovely, and the Lord added to their numbers day by day. And that's a great story, except what weren't those original disciples doing? They weren't going to Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. They weren't fulfilling the commission Christ gave right before his ascension. When did they start doing that? After a great persecution broke out. It was then that they were scattered abroad. And as they fled from their homes in Jerusalem, going across the Roman Empire, seeking safety, they took with them their love of God. They took with them their story of salvation through Christ crucified, dead, and risen. And they spread that message everywhere they went. Paul, the great missionary apostle Paul, was actually kind of second to spreading the gospel around. The ones he persecuted began that work. So once again we see immigration, movement from home to not home, is central to what God is doing. And we can even see that even if that immigration comes under forced and coerced circumstances, it can still be good. It can still be holy. It can still be part of God's plan. So let me pause right there. And I should have said this at the outset. We're going to have a time after this little lecture where we get to kind of dig in to dessert, but also conversation. But if in the course of my presenting, if you have questions for clarity, by all means, hands up. I want to hear those questions for clarity. Because it's going to be a longish sort of presentation, 45 minutes, an hour, kind of depending upon how many of those questions I get. And I want to make sure that you're not trying to remember something from the first 10 minutes of it. So, in terms of my first movement of this talk, the theology of immigration, are there any questions, any thoughts, anything you need clarity on? Yeah. Well, that's the open question, isn't it? I think that's going to be the question. So the question was, not everybody who's coming across the border is necessarily guided by God. I don't know if the people at the end of Acts 8:4 there, if those who are just fleeing because of persecution would have thought in that moment, this must be what it's like to be led by God, right? They probably would have thought, I don't want to be killed, and I have to do something to protect my children. Exactly, yeah. But how the scriptures re-narrate their oppression and their fleeing is, I think, telling for how we ought to narrate refugees today. Absolutely. That's what I'm hoping the through line is showing, that immigration, whether it is of divine command or seeming persecution, immigration is always paired with God doing a new thing. Okay, yep. Any other questions for clarity? Now, you can contest this thesis with me. I'll be honest with you, this is not a thesis that I learned from like a seminary professor. This is one born of my own genius. And so it is definitely open for debate. And I think if I'm on to something truthful, you trying to bat it around a little bit isn't going to hurt it. And if it isn't truthful, then you trying to bat it around will get me to stop going around and saying a lie. So don't feel shy about pushing against this thesis. But my prevailing thesis, when I try to think about immigration theologically and not just as a sociological or a political phenomenon, my thesis is that whenever God wants to do a new thing, God uses immigration. All right, so that is the biblical narrative, as I see it, on immigration. But again, part of the reason I went on the trip that I took this past April was to, and I guess it's been 6 months exactly since I was down there, was to interrogate and maybe even deconstruct the cultural narrative around immigration. Now, probably that's already a misnomer. Probably there are cultural narratives in the plural, but if there is a single cultural narrative around immigration, it was spoken in June of 2015. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. President Trump, former President Trump, has become a very polarizing figure in our culture, but that is not what I'm focused on right now. I'm focused on the fact that I do think former President Trump narrated the prevailing cultural assumptions around immigration in those words, which he spoke at Trump Tower on the day that he announced his candidacy in the Republican Party for President of the United States. That is the cultural narrative I think that we have been living under for, well, gosh, almost a full decade now. Those words, again, come to us from June of 2015. So that's the cultural narrative I was going down to the border to interrogate. Was Mr. Trump correct, or was he incorrect? We'll find out. It's important when traveling on any sort of mission trip to, of course, not travel alone. And so here are my travel companions. There in the center is Jan Larson McLaughlin. Jan is a local journalist in Bowling Green. She helped co-found BG Independent Media. And I would recommend to you BG Independent, is it media or news? News. BG Independent News. She co-founded BG Independent News, and I would recommend you go to bgindependentnews.org because she wrote 5 amazing articles out of this trip down to the border. And by the time you're done reading her articles, you'll think, I really could have saved my time listening to that guy on Sunday night. It was great to take a journalist with us because, again, when we're dealing with cultural narratives, you want good storytellers with you. The other fine fellow with us is Olio Lokai. Olio is a PhD student at Bowling Green State University, and he is here on a student visa from Trinidad. And if you ask me, Pastor Jeff, were you nervous about taking somebody from Trinidad with just a student visa across the border 3 separate times because you never know, could he get back in? Yeah, I was very nervous about that. And sure enough, every time we crossed into Mexico, things were fine. Every time we tried to cross back into the United States, I spent 30 seconds talking with Customs and Border Patrol. Oleo got to spend 4 or 5 minutes talking with Customs and Border Patrol. But this is who we had with us. We took this photo, by the way, outside of a Cracker Barrel in San Antonio, the first time Oleo had ever been to a Cracker Barrel. So he must not have liked it. He doesn't have a very big smile. We went, as I mentioned, our sojourning companions were from Trinity Presbyterian Church in Flower Mound, Texas. That goofy fella on the far left in the mustard hoodie, that is my buddy Jake. I didn't do a close-up because he's got this ridiculous mustache that he curls and waxes up into points, and I'm not trying to support that fashion choice by him. I'm not going to put that up on a big screen for everybody to see. I keep telling him he's got to get rid of that thing. But Jake is the pastor down in Texas, where, as you can imagine, they talk about immigration maybe a little bit more than we do in Ohio and in Michigan, though, as we're going to see, immigration is a nationwide issue. It's not the exclusive purview of the 4 southern border states. So Jake brought along 9 congregants, so there were, like 12 or 13 of us in total. We went on this trip under the care of the Practice Mercy Foundation, which was founded and is executive led by Alma Ruth there. And you can see Practice Mercy's mission. Practice Mercy is located in McAllen, Texas, and every day, Alma or members of her board or other volunteers are making border crossings to go and care for immigrants on the Mexican side, would-be refugee, would-be asylees, as well as caring for those who have entered into the country. You can see that they have a focus on women and children, but I think they're open to caring for any who have need. Alma is a lifelong missionary herself. She has lived and served in Central America, in Jerusalem, and a couple of other places that are escaping my mind right now. But she was the one who kind of gave us the lay of the land. It was her board members who volunteered to come along that worked as translators for us. I think only 1 or 2 people on the trip from mine and Jake's 2 churches had even a working knowledge of Spanish, and so we were eternally grateful for their getting us to and from across the border safely and helping us actually have meaningful interaction with these would-be asylees. Now, I'm talking about asylum because immigration is this big spectrum issue. Right? We have so many different types of immigrants. We have, H-1B visas who are worker immigrants, and if you have eaten a piece of produce in the past 6 months, whether in a can or fresh, thank a migrant worker. Those weren't all white hands that were picking those, I promise you that. We have people like Oleo, who are here on student visas. We have folks who are trying to find other ways to become citizens. We have other worker visa programs. This talk tonight, and whatever expertise I have, is really about the thin slice of refugees. These are people who no longer have a home country to return to for any number of different reasons, who are seeking a fresh start. And so, we are going to focus ourselves going forward specifically on being a refugee and the asylum process. And before we get into my talk, or not my talk, but into the actual border crossings and what we learned there, it's really important for all of us to understand the asylum process as it exists right now in the United States. And remember, every bit of this process could be changed. It's all policy. New policy can be written with different and new outcomes. So if there's anything you're hearing tonight in terms of our asylum process where you're like, that doesn't make a lot of sense, That's okay. The good news is none of those laws have been chiseled into granite. We have the opportunity before us to put in place different and maybe better policies. So let's get into that asylum process. It is, don't worry, just an easy 15-step process. There are subpoints. So the first thing you have to do if you want to be an asylum seeker, if you want to be a refugee in the United States of America, is you have to travel to the U.S.-Mexico border. And as you can see, there is a difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee. Refugees are processed in their home countries and then arrive to America with certain legal rights already in hand. Asylum seekers begin their claim already in America. And so the process that I'll be describing today is about being an asylum seeker. So again, you could, if you were in Croatia and had a valid claim to be a refugee, you could begin that process in your home country. And once you've established that you are a legal refugee, America has granted you that status, you can come over and you have a boatload of rights, as should be the case. But asylum seekers have to make their way to the border first. You can't just make it, though, to any part of the border. The border extends 2,000 miles across 4 U.S. states and 44 U.S. counties, but you are only allowed to enter legally through an official point of entry. POE is an acronym that you'll learn or you'll get used to if you do reading on this topic. And there are 26 official ports of entry along the southern border of the United States. This, by the way, was the first place where I began to suspect maybe we don't have a really good immigration policy. Because if you've got 2,000 miles of land, but you're funneling people to just 26 entry points, what happens? Bottlenecks. Intentional, by design, bottlenecks. Why do you get a camp of 3,000 refugees? Because you gave them one point of entry, and the next closest one might be 100 miles that way or 150 miles that way. I mean, who's going to walk that extra 100, 150 miles? That's like a week more of walking. So people start to amass at the official ports of entry. And by the way, any talk about illegals? That's not these people. If these people are at an official port of entry, they're following our laws. That's what legality looks like. It is true that if you cross into America, not through an official port of entry, you cannot just give yourself over to local authorities, surrender yourself, and ask for asylum. They'll say, I'm sorry, you didn't come through an official port of entry, and they will take you and they will place you right back across the border, typically into the care of Mexican authorities. Some Mexican authorities, and we didn't witness any of this, but some Mexican authorities, upon receiving immigrants who have crossed not through an official port of entry, but technically illegally, will then take those same migrants and in many instances truck them 2,000 miles back down to the Darien Gap. I heard an NPR report of one woman who was at the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexico side still. Sixth time she had traversed the length of Mexico to get back up to that border. So you have to enter through an official port of entry. Now, once you get within about 50 miles or so of the U.S.-Mexico border, you can download the CBP One app. I'm older than iPhones, and so I remember when iPhones came out and the big slogan was, there's an app for that. Do you guys remember that marketing campaign? Because there was an app for everything. There really is now officially an app for everything because there is an app to become an asylum seeker. Our government has created an application to be used on a smartphone. And you can download that and begin to upload your information when you're within a certain proximity of the U.S.-Mexico border. Ideally, what you're doing is you're going to upload information that you also have in like print form so you can verify that later when you're actually in the custody of either Mexican or American officials. But you begin to upload your information, who you are, where you're from, family with you, etc., etc., etc. And then every day after you've made your claim through the app, every day you wake up and you check the CBP One app, and it will update daily and tell you whether or not you have an appointment. Most days, you don't, so you power down your cell phone to preserve your battery life. Oh, by the way, how many people here, when you think refugee, thinks smartphone owner? No hands went up. Exactly. There's already a weird sort of tech barrier at work here. Now, interestingly, the vast majority of migrants do have smartphones at least capable enough of downloading that app and filling out their information. But we've really sort of digitized this process. There's more refugees living on the cloud than there are living on our border right now. So eventually you will get your appointment. Typical wait time is between 2 and 8 months, and as you can see there, nation of origin does factor in. You know, this isn't a first come, first serve sort of thing. Oh, question. Where are people staying? Typically in refugee camps. Yeah, which we'll get a glimpse of very shortly because I've got images from that. But yeah, the vast majority would not have like hotel lodging or that sort of thing. You often have folks who are traveling fairly impoverished to begin with. So they're sleeping outdoors. They have constructed, as you'll see, some pretty elaborate homes using plywood, tarps, etc. But it does look kind of like a scene out of your favorite zombie apocalypse movie or TV show at times. Yeah, good question. Any others? Okay. Raise your hand like she did. That was perfect. So you're going to wait 2 to 8 months. You're going to get your appointment, and nation of origin does factor in. You know, if you, I don't know how this would happen, but if you're a Ukrainian at the US-Mexico border, you're probably going to get an appointment within the first couple of weeks. But God forbid you're a Haitian. Because long before we started making up lies about them in my home state of Ohio, Haitians were a reviled immigrant population in America. Long reviled. And so we bake prejudice into our system. We're not even trying to hide it, is my main takeaway with that aside. So you get your appointment, and by the way, when you open up your app and it says you have an appointment, that doesn't mean you have an appointment in 90 minutes, clean yourself up and walk across the border. We met one young man, and I'll tell you more about him later. We met one young man who got his appointment and he had to wait 3 more weeks. But he was still over the moon because at least he had his date. So you first submit yourself to the Mexican authorities. Yes?
Sorry, maybe you already said that. Where did this list of 6 directions come from?
Oh, this is what we learned on the trip from a board member of Practice Mercy Foundation who's a lawyer. And so these are notes basically that I'm bringing back from that trip.
How would somebody waiting to get across the border get this information?
That's a great question, and one that I cannot answer with any, like I didn't have a conversation with any would-be refugee or asylee and got a chance to ask them that. It does seem that Mexican authorities understand what the process is, and so they will communicate that. People who cross illegally and then are, while they're in the custody of, say a county sheriff or whomever, might explain to them what the process is, might even tell them where the next or closest official port of entry is. Word does get out. I also suspect that migrants are talking to each other as they're walking, as they come up to official ports of entry. There are folks who are already waiting that know the rules, and they share that. But it does seem to exist kind of as an oral tradition, past one person to the next. Yeah.
Could you speak very briefly about the politics of the country of origin? For example, are enemies of the United States put further down the list? Do countries that we have fairly normal relationships with in Central America go to the top of the list? Is there a politics in that?
That's a great question. I have to trust that there is, because there's a politics to just about everything. I can't speak definitively to the answer of what the politics is. I just know that some nations of origin get more favored status than others. And that can be potentially a reflection of any political violence. That can be a reflection of trade agreements. It can be a reflection of the broader context of our relationship as a country with other countries. But I just know that nation of origin does factor in. Yeah. These are great questions that honestly, I'm a great person to ask, but a better one would be whoever your local representative is. And if he or she can't answer it, well, that's a problem, isn't it? So you get your pre-screening in Mexico. You first have to, if you're a would-be asylee, you have to submit yourself to the Mexican authorities. And I want to pause here and use this as a jumping off point for a different conversation. Our immigration policy in America right now is 100% contingent upon Mexican cooperation. Now, on the whole, that doesn't bother me. Mexico is one of our closest neighbors. We probably even like them more than the Canadians because their food is better. Oh, you all went to Canada, Belle, for dinner tonight? No. There's poutine, there's hockey, and then we don't know what to do with the rest of that country up north. So I have no problem that America and Mexico are working collaboratively together on this. We're the tradition of Fred Rogers, and being a good neighbor is central to our sense of piety in Christ, right? So I'm happy that America and Mexico are working together. But where are all the refugee camps actually taking place? In Mexico, right on the border. As you'll see, sometimes in city parks that aren't city parks anymore. And who are the first people to do screening on behalf of America? Mexican authorities. Now, I have no doubt that America and Mexico has made arrangements, I'm sure even fiscal arrangements, as they should. If you were to ask your next door neighbor to mow your lawn and watch over your house while you're gone for a month in the summer, you'd probably want to kick them a little love some way or another, right? That's only reasonable. But our entire immigration policy right now is hinged upon Mexico not getting fed up with our immigration policy, because this isn't their immigration policy that you've got on the screen. This is the American one. They're just a vital piece. And if they pull out their part in it, it's a house of cards. But at any rate, they haven't yet. That's only a future concern. At present, you submit yourself to Mexican authorities where you do pre-screening. You show them your CBP one-up. You show them whatever paperwork you have. You prove to them that you are who you are and that your claim seems valid enough to talk to American authorities. And so that's what happens next. You get escorted across the U.S.-Mexico border, physically escorted. You're not in cuffs or anything, but you are walking with people who still have firearms on their waists, and so that's a little weird. Not most of us do that any day. And so you enter America, and once you are officially in America, you say, I request asylum. And then you are given an asylum date. You are processed in America. You are not granted asylum immediately. Asylum has to go through a civil court system. So you are let into the country, and we say, we are going to see you in immigration court 2.5 years from now. That's the current backlog. Asylum proceedings must take place in a federal court. That makes sense. Asylum proceedings are a civil court case. That's really important because a civil court proceeding means that Sixth Amendment guarantees to a timely trial and legal representation do not apply. Even if you're an illegal immigrant and you commit a criminal act, our amendments still apply to you. You're still given due process. You're still given a Fifth Amendment right to not self-incriminate. You're still given the Sixth Amendment right to representation and a speedy trial. Not for a civil matter. Those are only for criminal cases. Civilly, we can leave you in a sort of legal purgatory for as long as the backlog lasts. And as more people have been flooding through, the backlog is only backlogging more and more. Now, immediately, you are released into America with no real official identity or standing. It's not like you're given a driver's license and said, like, yeah, you can drive around, but you can't vote or anything like that. You're kind of a quasi-legal entity in America. The first thing you're going to do, though, once you cross the border is stop by Catholic Charities. And Catholic Charities is going to let you stay there for up to 3 days, or a similar organization. That Catholic Charities is doing really great work down on the border. And they're going to give you a cot, they're going to give you 3 squares, they're going to give you a shower, thanks be to God, and most importantly, they're going to give you an opportunity to call or email or text family or friends that you already have in the United States, because the vast majority, and I'm even hedging my bets, I want to say every person we met who was a would-be asylee in Mexico, they already had friends, or more importantly, family in the United States. In fact, in many instances, it wasn't just like your third cousin twice removed that you had to invite to your wedding because your mother told you to. We're talking about parents, siblings, children, close family. So you get to Catholic Charities, you say, I've got a cousin in Albuquerque, I've got a sibling in Kansas City. They get you set up, that sibling sends some money, you get a bus ticket, a train ticket, whatever they can afford, and you are on your way. By the way, I share that part of the story because for the most part, when we ask people, when you get to America, where do you want to go? Nobody was like, I figure we just stay right on the border. For all the hand-wringing of, say, Governor Abbott out of Texas or Governor DeSantis out of Florida about this mass immigration problem, the vast majority of immigrants we met didn't want to stay in Texas or go to Florida. Hear, hear, says a Midwesterner like me. I also don't want to go to Texas or Florida. In fact, one of my favorite guys I met, we were chatting, and I said, where are you trying to go? And he said, Columbus, Ohio. And I said, well, that's great. I just moved from an area close to Columbus. Go to Schmidt's Sausage House when you get there. Magnificent, magnificent food. So yeah, folks are trying to get to where their family are all across the country, because of course they are. What would you do in similar circumstances? So after 6 months, you can apply for a work permit. Anybody here, let me just pause, anybody here ever lose their job suddenly? You don't have to share if it's embarrassing or anything. Okay. Anybody ever here go through a long season of unemployment where you couldn't find a job? Wow, you all are a really gifted group of people. You're like, no, people pretty much headhunt me. Well, I have. I kind of got canned from my last church job. I didn't start with that because then you wouldn't listen to me the rest of this time. And I spent about 8 months, admittedly with a severance, so like we were financially okay, but I spent about 8 months unemployed. And I'll tell you what, it's heartbreaking. You know you've got skills, you know you've got abilities, you know you've got the ability to contribute, but there's nowhere to do that. So these immigrants who do get legal entry into the United States and who are waiting an asylum date 2 to 2.5 years in advance have to wait 6 months before they can apply for a work permit. So that means they make it to their cousin's couch in Kansas City and they sit there feeling like a freeloader. And that is demoralizing. They want to work. They want to be given the legal opportunity to work in a legal way. They want to have Social Security pulled out of their paycheck that they may or may not never get to collect, but all of you, or many of you, are right now as we speak, right? They want to contribute, but for 6 months we make them wait. That for me is, by the way, one of the most inhumane things. I think work is good, toil is bad. That's how the curse story goes at the beginning of Genesis. Work is great. To be able to work and contribute and support a family and care for a community, that's really good. And if you got a job like that right now, you should be grateful for it. That's what these folks want, but we force them to wait for 6 months, sitting on somebody's couch, kind of mooching and feeling terrible about it. That's a great question. I can tell you what the rationale for that is. Because what are all these immigrants coming here to do? Yeah, take the jobs. I mean, rape, murder, and drugs. But when they're done doing that, then they're going to clean up and take your job. I think 6 months is a compromise to recognize that refugees are allowed to be let in, but we don't want them immediately coming and taking American jobs. By the way, that's a myth. Almost no refugees are taking jobs that Americans want to do. Ask any farmer, hey, how come you didn't hire a bunch of Americans? And they'll say, hey, because none of them applied, right? So I don't know why that is, other than we just don't want it to be too convenient. I mean, as you can see by now, this policy isn't set up to encourage immigration. It is set up to discourage immigration. So I think it's a quasi-punitive decision. Yeah.
What are the consequences if you go to work without a permit?
Great question. What's the consequences if you work without a permit? Well, if you're caught, that will be held against you at your asylum hearing, and it all but guarantees that your asylum will be denied and you will be deported. But the real tragedy is, what happens when you're working off of the books? What protections do you have? Does OSHA apply to you? No. There is predatory labor practices happening right now in America because we deny people legal standing and we put them in the murky places where they can be abused by bad acting bosses, American bosses. Yeah. 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 And interestingly, the punishments that are incurred by Americans who employ illegal labor are nothing compared to the punishments on the labor itself. Again, to hazard a rough analogy, it's like, why do we criminalize the sex worker and not the John, right? It's kind of that sort of situation. Any other questions? Yeah.
When were these guidelines developed or incorporated, and did they change with administration?
There could be nuances via executive order. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it used to be pretty simple in America. Legislators legislated and executives executed, right? But now we've got pretty powerful executive orders, but no executive order can fully turn back legislation. So this outline for asylum came to us somewhere in the 1980s during Reagan's administration, which was the last time America passed any meaningful immigration policy. It is 40 plus years old. And by the way, what was the prevailing concern in the 1980s if you're thinking international? Cold War. What are the prevailing concerns today? Terrorism and trade. So we've got Cold War policy trying to serve us in a terrorism and trade time period. As times change, policy has to change. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That's why we don't really chisel anything into stone. Heck, we even had an amendment that says you can't drink booze, and then we made another amendment that said you could. I mean, that's supposed to be part of the genius of the American system, is that you can always develop policies to reflect the time you're in. But we're not doing that anymore. We haven't since the 80s. Yeah. Yes. All right, I'm working from memory now. There is a wonderful, if you want to go deeper on this topic, there is a wonderful podcast series, 6 episodes, so it's manageable, called Untangled. It comes out of WOSU, the Columbus affiliate for NPR. And in Untangled, they interviewed a number of legal scholars around this. And I believe the idea was that if we employed 700 more federal judges, we could reduce the backlog by a year. So maybe it was something like that. For every 700 more we employed, we could take a year off of the backlog. But that's a big number. Yeah. But yes, funding has to come first. Oh, yeah. That is true, yeah. Or, yes, and language is important, and if I misuse any language, I assure you it's not with malice, it's that some of these words have very technical definitions. I mean, the difference between refugee and asylee, or asylum seeker, is already fairly big. Because remember, refugees start in a different country. Sounds like that's what you're working on. You vet them for 3 or 4 years, whether in their home country, they have all their legal check marks arranged.
National organizations in order to be approved as refugees.
Exactly. Yep. But if you have to flee more quickly than you have time to go through that process, then you're at the southern border and you're an asylum seeker. Though I bet even informally, an asylum seeker or an asylee would say, oh, I'm a refugee from. Because again, language has technical uses and then informal uses. But thank you for that clarity. That is important. So you eventually get your asylum hearing where you are likely to be denied. There's only a 20% acceptance rate on average, with some estimates as low as 14%. By the way, of those 14 or 20%, whatever the precise number is, the vast, vast, vast majority of them have been able to afford a lawyer. Which really represents, which demonstrates, which signals that our refugee process is really less about do you have a legitimate claim to be a refugee and more about can you afford a lawyer. It's pay to play. Now there are real people who really are coming with a real claim to be refugees, but if you can't afford a lawyer, there's a really good chance that you're going to be denied. Because, again, from that Untangled podcast, one of the lawyers that the host of the podcast interviewed said that her average filing for a successful asylum case is 300 pages. So imagine creating a 300-page document in your own language and then having it have to be legally translated to English to be submitted to the court. That's what you kind of need to get asylum status in America. Well, really, only lawyers can get that sort of work done for you. And there's frankly just not enough pro bono ones working, which means that it ultimately boils down to those with means, they get that asylum or that refugee type status. It's a broken system. If your asylum is denied, you can appeal, which will give you more time in the country. And then deportation is inevitable, not inevitable. Deportation is now legal if the appeal is denied, but we don't frankly have a very good deportation system set up either. Because we may deny refugee status to, or asylum status to somebody from, just as an example, like Guatemala, but we may not have a good enough working relationship with the Guatemalan government to just drop a plane load of denied asylees. So now you're left in America, no longer legally here at all, because your asylum has been denied and even your appeal for asylum has been denied, but the government doesn't immediately deport you. From that podcast, one of the asylum lawyers said, the real goal at this point, and because lawyers are pretty practical, shrewd people, the real goal at this point is to delay the denial of asylum until a person has cultivated a different reason to stay in the country. They've met and married an American citizen. They have a child, especially a child with special needs in America that the government recognizes can't be cared for in their country of origin. Work, if you can find a company that will actually sponsor your immigration and your work visa. So they're really, because we've got this huge backlog, and because by the time you make it through the asylum appeal process, you might be 4 years after you've crossed into America, they're really just looking for any other excuse to keep you here. That feels a little disingenuous, I'll admit, but it's disingenuous based upon a broken system that we've created. Again, we have a different system. I think people get to act with a little bit better integrity in the process. Oh, by the way, the majority of folks who are coming across are anywhere between like 20s and 40s. I suppose that a 70-year-old could decide that things are too terrible in El Salvador and take off, but I think by and large folks are just like, I probably am just going to keep my head down and try to persevere here. So it really is kind of a younger population coming up, which is great for our workforces, but also, what do you know 20-year-olds to do? They fall in love and make babies. They make lives for themselves. 4 years is a long time in your 20s. 4 years in my 20s lasted 20 years. It was amazing. In my 40s, 4 years feels like 3 days. But yeah, I mean, we're letting in folks at 22 years old. They're landing, in many instances, major cities. They're part of large immigrant communities in those cities. Some legal immigrants, some here seeking asylum, some refugees. They're going to do what 20-year-olds do. They're going to meet each other. They're going to fall in love. So now, at the end of the process, you might be sending somebody home, who has a wife and a child, that sort of thing. I mean, we got to take those sorts of realities into consideration if we're going to make a realistic policy. All right, so who is terribly bored with our immigration policy? No, I am. That stuff is hard. And this, by the way, is what you're expected to kind of know and understand if you're a non-native English, you don't have English skills very well, you're coming out of El Salvador, who knows what sort of education you have. This is the simple process that we've laid out for you. Again, I'm convinced that this is not a process for entrance. This is a process for denial. We are trying to discourage, by making it as laborious as possible, any immigration, even immigration that needs to occur under the burden of being a refugee. Before we get to my pictures, I swear I'm building to something worth seeing here. At this point, you're like, did you just forget to take pictures while you were down at the border? No. Before we do, I want to give us a quick excursus, and this unfortunately has become increasingly important. So, did I turn this thing off? Oh, I think I did. I think it turned off. I talked too long and the clicker turned off. There we go. Why is refugee/asylum important? Refugee standards are international standards. We do not create those on our own. We have created those with our international partners, and we largely created them after World War II. And we largely created them after World War II because of this story right here. A boat carrying 937 refugees, almost all of whom were Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, is turned away first from Havana, Cuba on May 27, 1939, and could not find respite in America or Canada. They will eventually be sent back across the ocean. Many of them were lucky enough to get some safe refuge in Western Europe, though if you know anything about World War II and how things would unfold between 39 and 45, Western Europe wasn't always the greatest place to be either. But 254 of them would later die. It's 1939. America is not yet in the war. In fact, here's a part of the history we don't like to say. It's 1939, and America is not sure which side we're going to choose, because we've got some pretty big business interests in Germany as we help them rebuild after World War I. We weren't sure. Is Germany a good guy or bad guy? In 1939, we were trying to sit that question out. So a bunch of Jews fleeing Nazi persecution show up to our shores, and we send them away. 254 of them would die, presumably in those gas chambers that took 6 million Jewish lives in the Shoah. This is why refugee status is important. I hear today politicians talking about just getting rid of this entire concept of refugee or asylum. They want to know, why do we have to even participate in this? Isn't it part of a globalist propaganda? It's because we did turn our back on refugees before. And we had better remember that we did that, and we had better lament that every day, and we had better commit to never doing it again. One other thing, and I don't have a slide. You're also going to hear some politicians these days talk about revising the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that established birthright citizenship. That is to say that if you're born in America, you're an American. Doesn't matter what your parents' nation of origin is. If you're born on this land, we think that means something. But that wasn't law until about 150 years ago with the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which was one of two post-Civil War amendments. And why did we have to create birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment? Because after slavery was ended with the Emancipation Proclamation and the North kicking the South's butt, my Southern friends hate it when I describe it that way, Southern states said, fine, we can't have slaves, but we're not going to regard these people as citizens either. And they began their own talk of deportation programs. And so we had to ratify the 14th Amendment to say, if you're born in America, you are an American. You will hear politicians today, major political candidate politicians, at least entertain the option of revoking birthright citizenship from the 14th Amendment. They want to amend the amendment, which again, that's part of the genius of our system, but that seems like a very dangerous gambit, because that means you could be born in this country and still deported to a different country. It's only that 14th Amendment that guarantees birthright citizenship. But so hot and angry runs the animus against immigrants and non-Native Americans that we're open to that sort of thing. So let's keep our international agreements around being a refugee in place. Let's keep the 14th Amendment in place. Okay, where are we at? Finally and at long last, we are, goodness, I just jumped. Okay, there we go. Finally, at long last, we are up to my trip. And so we began on our first day of border crossings, crossing from Progreso, Texas, and Nuevo Progreso, Mexico. By the way, I like to point this out. I don't know jack about Spanish. I studied German in high school, so that was my fault. But I do know enough to know that Nuevo means new. So that is Progreso and New Progreso. And I point this out because the Texas-Mexico border especially, and I assume this is true into New Mexico, Arizona, and California, are full of really important and vital sister cities. Cities that have grown up side by side. Cities with a symbiotic relationship. We saw people crossing over into Mexico clearly on date night, right? And I know for Northerners, we're like, what? But that's what they would do. I mean, honey, what do you want? Mexican? Sure, let's just run for the border, literally. And so I love, again, good neighbors, cities rising up together, growing together, having a symbiotic relationship. Some Mexican workers coming legally into America to work, maybe clean homes, do that sort of thing. Taking better money back to their families, supporting their families, that sort of thing. Americans going over to Mexico, having some fun legally, hopefully, not Tijuana style. And, having a nice night and then going back. That sort of intermingling should be beautiful and should be celebrated, right? So that's how it is working for legal citizens. But Nuevo Progreso was the first place we visited, and it wasn't a border camp. As you can see, their camp was no camp at all, but rather the sidewalk leading up to the U.S.-Mexico border. They just had to put their tents on the one sidewalk. I believe my next one, you can see some more of the tents along the sidewalk. Just to give you a nice side-by-side comparison. There we go. On the right side is our walking into Mexico. See how big and open and spacious it is? I pirouetted the entire way across. On the other side, the left side of the screen, is what it's like walking from Mexico into America. Because in Nuevo Progreso, they're only permitting the asylum seekers to camp out on the side of the sidewalk. By the way, I don't know. Possibly. We did see a lot of public-private partnership sort of thing. As you'll see in some of our other refugee camps, there are porta potties. And you're like, well, the refugees didn't bring those with them, right? I think they were being provided by the city, or in certain instances, I think private citizens in Mexico are stepping up to care for people because, they can see people as people. They can see when people have needs. And especially when it comes to porta potties, what do we read to our children before bedtime? Everybody poops. So, of course. By the way, quick question. Which country of origin do you think the folks in Nuevo Progreso are from? Shout it out. Guatemala? No. Ecuador, El Salvador, Haiti? No. Huh? Colombia? Nope. Nope, not Mexico. Not Venezuela. Now you're just like, well, this is becoming a terrible geography test. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, all the Stan countries, those former Soviet bloc countries. Do not ask me. how they got from Central Asia over to the US-Mexico border. And don't even ask me how they all kind of found each other, though that one actually does make sense to me. I feel like immigrants probably talk to one another, and if you were an immigrant in a different land, you would probably try to find somebody that spoke your language, understood your culture, had a little bit of shared history, right? But these were largely immigrants from the STAN countries, which is a reminder that this is not exclusively a Mexican, Central American, South American problem. It is largely that. But as I noted at the outset, we have 120 million forced migrants in the world right now. Right? Think about where all those Syrians went when Syria started to crumble. Those are forced migrants, right? Now, most of them aren't here. Some of them are, but they're in Turkey and other surrounding countries. But we're talking 120 million people who are displaced from their homeland at this moment. So having Uzbekis here, not that surprising.
If you're coming from a different country besides Mexico or South America, do you have to go to Mexico as a port of entry?
No, in theory you could go through a northern port of entry. I suspect there's some economic considerations to that. Also, if you're going to be left out for 2 to 8 months, does anybody want to camp in Canada for 2 to 8 months? It snows there 9 months out of the year, I think. Yeah. So I do not know quite why the southern border, other than the southern border has just historically been a place of egress. But no, any official port of entry in America, and by the way, every international airport is an official port of entry as well. Like when you pass through customs, when you fly internationally, say into like O'Hare in Chicago or something, that's an official port of entry too, but we're not dealing with folks who are necessarily got the means to just like fly in, post up at the Ritz-Carlton and wait for the American process to run its course, right? So I think the southern border is just well known as an affordable route. So this is one form of refugee camps that you can see, and it's just piled up along the side. We saw a lot of like ramen noodles. I don't even know how folks get the hot water for that, but they figure out how to eat and survive lined up on that side of the bridge walking into America, and that's where they wait. We got to our first like traditionally understood refugee camp or asylum seeker camp when we drove down to Brownsville, Texas, and entered into Matamoros, Mexico. This is what you would imagine, right, in your mind, an immigration or a refugee camp looking like. There are tarps, tents, plywood. You can see some porta potties kind of just left of center there. And this camp at its peak was about 3,000 members strong. When we got there in April of this year, it was roughly like 75. That, by the way, is the other thing. I hear these numbers of like a gajillion people cross our border every day or something like that. The number keeps going up the closer we get to November 5th. I don't know what that's about. But the numbers at the camps weren't overloaded. They were during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, we shut that whole process down. Those 15 steps I noted earlier, none of those steps took place. We had a firm public health ban. And that ban did extend a little bit into even President Biden's tenure. I don't think it was released until May-ish, June-ish of 2021, I think. All under the premise, again, of public health. So this is the camp, now about 75, 80 people. We used to have about 3,000. And here's just some glimpses of life in the camp. Here we go. You can see well, you got the porta potties on the right. You see families together. You see that baby. And now again, Bree and I don't have children, so I don't know how old babies are just by looking at them, but that baby looks to be about how old? Like, is that 3 months or younger probably? Top left corner? Huh? 6 months? Okay, good. It takes typically 3 to 4 months to walk up to the border from most places south of the border. I don't even understand the physics of that and the physiology of that. I don't understand how a mother gives birth and maybe a few months later gets to walk in and hitch in a couple thousand of miles. By the way, everybody was thrilled to see us. They were truly, truly excited to tell their story. They were excited to see some earnest gringos. I was told that I was the whitest person any of them have ever seen. They didn't say that, but I know it's true. They were thinking it. By the way, you'll see barbed wire fencing up around. That was installed by the Mexican government to try to contain and cage these would-be asylees. And they did tell stories of the Mexican authorities coming along, especially late at night, and basically just messing with them. You know, throwing their stuff around, raiding the camp, just creating a little bit of chaos and havoc because they're vulnerable people with nobody to stick up for them. You see they're cooking, open fire style, by and large, harvesting, branches that fall, that sort of thing. While at this camp, we came across that travel journal, which was all in Spanish, but one of our hosts interpreted for us, and it showed basically the travel log, written very in brief, but it took about 3 months from somebody to get from, I forget the country of origin, or it might have even been lost to us. As you can see, it's pretty tattered. But there were dates extending about 3 months. We found that. This picture on the right, you see where the barbed wire is? All that riffraff hanging up there? That's what America looks like from the Mexican side of the border. Doesn't that fill you with patriotic pride? That is just on the other side of the Rio, and there is barbed wire all up that hill to that fence, which has barbed wire on top of it, and there's even barbed wire in that water. You may remember back about February of this year, a woman and 2 children, presumably her children, were trying to ford the Rio, and they got caught up in some barbed wire that was hidden in the water where you can't really see it. And they got cut up and they couldn't extricate themselves, and all 3 drowned. That sort of thing is happening all along the U.S.-Mexico border. The clothing that you see attached to that barbed wire are people that just decided to give up on the official port of entry process and take their chances, having the clothes, and one has to assume the skin shed off their body by that barbed wire. That is what America looks like to a would-be asylee, and still they want to be here. I see that picture, and there's a big part of me that doesn't want to be here anymore. So that was day 1. On the second day, we took a trip on the Rio Grande, and I point this out only because I'd like to go back to the U.S.-Mexico border, and I'm hoping at least 2 of you are going to come with me in 2025. So we're going to take a nice boat tour, and it really is a nice boat tour. But we got to see, while touring along the Rio Grande, the different sides, the American and the Mexican side. And let me tell you what, it is, again, an exercise in difference. On the Mexican side, there were green, lush, natural parks all along, some developed for families to come and celebrate. You could almost envision quinceañeras there. And on the American side, it was barren, often with walls, including a private wall. This wall right here stretches 3 miles. It is not an official U.S. wall. Our federal government did not build this. A private citizen in Texas fundraised $9 million from his very apparently afraid neighbors to build 3 miles of this wall. And do you know why he did that? Because he has a private contracting company, and he really wanted a federal contract to build the wall. Yeah. And America is building walls at somewhere between $9 and $20 million per mile. You'll remember I said there's 2,000 miles. He was doing it at $3 million a mile. He wanted to point that out to the government, but he privately fundraised a meaningless 3-mile wall that definitely erodes like the natural landscape, not just aesthetically, but it starts messing with migration patterns of animals, etc., right? It kills vegetation as it goes. And so that's what the American side looks like. And again, the Mexican side was often very green and lush and lovely. We're here where we took off from the boat. We had ourselves a little meeting. Oh, by the way, on our second day, we had Mormon Women for Ethical Government join our trip. They had reached out to Alma Ruth, and they wanted to come along for a day. I love these ladies. They remind me of old school Presbyterian women, because I don't know if you know much about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they don't have female leadership. But let me tell you what, I met some of the best faith leaders I've ever met in those women, because they showed up and they wanted to confront this immigration problem with the same zeal that I wanted to confront it with. And I'll tell you, it was great. And talking with them, I felt like if Mormon women and a super crunchy, liberal, progressive Presbyterian pastor are on the same page, we might just solve this problem. It was like getting Mitt Romney and Sherrod Brown in a room together. So anyway, they joined us for this. We had a nice little reflection time and communion service here where we remembered the dead who died in the Rio Grande as we overlooked the Rio Grande. And then we come up to our last asylum seekers camp at Reynosa, which is right across from McAllen, Texas. And I swear I'm wrapping this up. But here we see our largest camp. This was probably about 120 members strong, I believe. You see how they get electric power. They tap into power coming down those power lines. And if you're like, that doesn't seem very safe, I can assure you my college dorm looked the exact same way. Just daisy chaining surge protectors, right? Reynosa was an amazing experience. Oh boy. Have I killed the battery on this thing? I would have figured with all my talking I'd kill the battery on the microphone first. Okay. Go ahead and next slide, please. Here is some life in the Reynosa camp. That thing on the right, that was their homemade stove. Clay built, they found themselves a piece of stainless steel metal to put in there. They baked it in there. There was a chimney kind of out the back. They built a little fire there, got the metal top hot, and they were able to cook their meals there. You can see that they were having water donated by a local resident because they were staying on somebody's private land here at this camp. He was providing them water where they were cleaning. You can kind of see one of their tarp homes. Next slide, please. You can just see more of domestic life. You see that there are children. One of the things that really stuck with me is I watched as a bunch of kids played together, and you'd watch like 2 or 3 moms watch all the kids together, and then they would the rest of the moms would kind of get a breather. And I'm like, that's happening at every preschool. That's happening at every public park in America this day, right? Like they're taking care of one another's kids. There are cats there because my friend Olio, who went on this trip, made this slideshow and he really likes cats. But also because these cats got adopted by families who, I mean, how many of you were parents and your kids said, can we get a dog or a cat? And you said fine because they guilted you into it? Can you imagine the parental guilt of dragging your kid 2,000 plus miles and making him live in a refugee camp? Can you even say no when they ask, can we have a cat? That's where they clean dishes. Next slide, please. Here are just some of the folks we got to meet and talk with. Next slide. This slide comes with a nice story. This story takes place, this photo was taken right after we had our first run-in with a drug cartel member. We were in this camp at Reynosa. We were talking. We were having a good time. Alma Ruth, who's Pentecostal, forced us to have a worship service spontaneously because that's how Pentecostals like to worship. Drives Presbyterians batty. Jake and I were asked to preach. Jake went first. He said all the things I was going to say, so I was toast. But while we were there, all of a sudden you could feel the mood shift. And I looked over and the gate was closed and a number of the guys who were living in the camp were standing in front of it. It's because they had seen a known cartel member walking by. And I want you to reflect on what they did. They had a bunch of us gringos, dumb, vulnerable. They knew where the dangers were. We didn't. And when they saw those dangers, they closed the door and they put their bodies between the danger and our bodies. One of the prevailing things that I've walked away from this trip with is that these would-be neighbors of ours are going to be great neighbors. None of the folks living in these camps knew each other before they got there. But they're sharing food, they're looking after each other's kids, and they know how to love the stranger in their midst. Would that every Christian in America be that good, right? How many of you right now have a neighbor that annoys you? Go ahead, we all do. Yeah. I found the people that you want to replace the annoying neighbor with. They're going to be great neighbors to us. They're already practicing that. Next slide, please. I'm going to conclude with this story. There are more slides, but I want us to get over to have desserts because, well, look at me. And we can continue the conversation, but I want to introduce you to Jairo. Jairo was at that Matamoros camp just on the other side of Brownsville, Texas, the second one we went to. We got there to Matamoros on Saturday. The Friday before, Jairo had opened up his CBP One app and discovered that he got his appointment. And picture this from Jairo's perspective. Finally, after waiting, I think he said he had been there 4 months, he opened up the app and he got his day. Now, it was still 3 weeks in advance, but still. That's the happiest day of his life. That happens on Friday. And then on Saturday, just a horde of chunky gringos show up. It had to feel like an angelic visitation to him. And Jairo was so proud. He's in that picture, he's showing us his kitchen. That was his home. He had constructed like a little toilet area separate from his bedding area. Smart choice. Jairo was so proud. The only thing that was bothering Jairo, those were the only clothes he had left, because other people had stolen his clothes, quite possibly some of those Mexican authorities that messed with them. And he was scared to death that he wasn't going to be able to get into America looking like that. Now, I think he just looks like an average Gen Zer personally, but I'm getting old. I don't know why people tear their blue jeans. But Jairo was the only time I cried on this trip. Because the whole time Jairo's talking with us through an interpreter, there was hope in his face. There was joy in his eyes. He was so stinking excited. And I was coming from America, knowing that we weren't as excited to greet Jairo as he was to greet us. He was joyful. I walked away and shed a few tears. And the emotion behind those tears was shame. Because we have to do better. We have to be able to greet excited strangers, hopeful, joyful strangers. We've got to be able to match them in that. What in the world did Christ live and die for if it wasn't for hope and joy, peace and love? All those candles you're going to light here in just a matter of a month or so. He's got those things. We've got something to learn about those things. Should have told Matt I wanted to do 3 talks simultaneously in a row. I am going to wrap it up there, like I said, because I think we can have good conversation, and I will get to the content of the rest of my slides. But really, who wants dessert? Yeah, good. Question? Well, you and I might just be in a different place. My fear is that a majority of Americans do fear immigrants. And I think we are being coached and groomed to fear immigrants. By one party, though I'm going to be honest with you, 2008, Obama won the presidency, and when he got inaugurated in 2009, he had a full House and Senate. And we didn't pass meaningful immigration policies then. He kind of fumbled the DACA. I have my political leanings. I drove up here in a Prius. That should tell you what they are. I'm not going to try to hide those things from you. You're all too smart, even if I did try to hide those things from you. So yeah, I tend to vote more and lean more left. But I'll be the first to tell you, there is not a political party that's gotten their head straight on this thing yet. Not if we've got over 40 years of broken immigration policies. Is one side more inflammatory in their rhetoric? Yeah, good grief. They're talking about eating pets down in Springfield. It's not happening. Of course they're more inflammatory. But even the ones who are talking nicely about this aren't changing the things that need to be changed. So my fear is that most Americans have been taught to fear immigrants. And maybe one of the things we can talk about is what our own assumptions are around immigration, what our feelings are, maybe places where we've changed and been reformed ourselves. But I don't know. America doesn't feel like the Statue of Liberty anymore. And I think that's coming from both sides, one aggressively and the other passively. Ideally, we are a melting pot. Yeah, ideally. Yeah. Huh? He says we are a melting pot. Yeah. Though I tell you, every generation, if you do the historical research, every generation has been taught to fear immigrants. I mean, my wife is of Italian descent. Your grandparents were born here, or one of them not? You don't remember? Okay. At most, Bree is fourth generation. She could be third generation Italian American. I can assure you that when Italians were showing up through Ellis Island in the early 20th century, they were greeted about as warmly as we're greeting Guatemalans. You know? Heck, Italians and Irish were considered black up until like the 1930s. Yeah. So, yeah, question. Oh, that's a great question. So one of the first major immigration policies in America's history was the Chinese Exclusion Act of like 1854 or something like that. By the way, it tells you everything about how Americans feel about immigration if one of the first major acts has the word exclusion in it. And that was because we had brought over a lot of Chinese workers to build our transcontinental railroad and to do some of the, 1849ers gold digging on the West Coast, and they cultivated a transcontinental system of transportation for us, but then we didn't want to return any sort of favors by giving them legal status in America, so we created the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that really has set the tone for America's immigration policy going forward. We tend to approach immigration not with this question, how can I love this stranger, but with the question, how can I keep this invading force out? But hey, we've got a 250th birthday coming up soon. Maybe we can make a resolution as a country to do better going forward for the next 250 years. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again for being here. If you can join us in the lounge, those of you who are from here can just lead us over. We've got coffee and cookies, and Jeff is willing to answer more questions. But thank you again. Let's thank Jeff one more time. Thank you. I'll lead the way.